Hello and welcome to the Athlete Archives. This is episode 3, Tugboat. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Thurman Munson. I vaguely knew the story of Thurman. I remember having his baseball card in 1979 when I was a kid, and I remember hearing about his death, but I didn't really know much about him. I knew that he kind of had a reputation of being an ornery guy, but that was it. I was surprised during my research to find out how many people called him the best teammate they ever had. Thurman was a grinder, a real tough guy on the field. If you were playing against Thurman, you probably hated him. But if he was your teammate, you probably loved him. Those of us who've played sports have probably had a teammate like that at some point. He had a bit of a reputation of being a standoffish guy, kind of grouchy, but he had a less than cordial relationship with the press at the time, and that never helps a player's public image. Sports writers wield a lot of power when it comes to perception, and it was even more true in the 1970s than it is today. What you're going to hear is the honest truth about Thurman, gleaned from multiple sources, but primarily Marty Appel's book, Munson. Marty worked for the Yankees during Thurman's career, so he had a good relationship with Thurman. Marty and Thurman actually co-wrote Thurman's autobiography before he passed, but in that book, Thurman didn't really talk about his childhood or his family. It's a filtered version of his story, and as you're about to hear, I can understand why. Thurman did not have a good childhood, but I think it's important to talk about so that you can understand Thurman, the man. Thurman Munson was born on June 7, 1947 in Akron, Ohio. He was the baby of the family with 2 sisters and 1 brother. When Thurman was 4, the family moved to Canton, Ohio, and this is where Thurman would always consider his home. Thurman's father, Darrell, was a long-haul truck driver. Let me just say that Darrell Munson was argumentative, hot-tempered, and abusive. He was fired and rehired many times for altercations on the job, and he was just generally an abrasive guy who seemingly couldn't get along well with anyone. Thurman's sister Darla is quoted as saying, quote, "He'd come home after a week away and just start hitting us. A fist across the head. It was scary. He'd throw things. I remember Mom off to the side crying. I try to get over things, but it hasn't been easy. I don't remember anything good about my childhood." Thurman's mother, unfortunately, suffered a stroke in her 50s, and Thurman's father, at this time, he was living in Florida and caring for her initially, put this 50-year-old stroke victim on a bus and sent her to Canton, Ohio. He told his kids, "I'm done with her, you deal with her." So I think this paints a pretty clear picture of Darrell Munson, but to drive the point home, I read an interview with Darrell after Thurman's death. Quote, "You couldn't tell Thurman anything. He was pampered and babied till the cows came home by his mother. He figured he had a market on brains too, but he didn't. Thurman's trouble was he had too much natural ability. Some people, like myself, have to struggle to be good at something. It came natural to Thurman. I had natural talent as a ball player. Even today, I have fast reflexes. I wish I could have made it to the big leagues because I think I could have outdone Thurman. I would have been better than him." This is a dad talking about his dead son. I just can't even believe it. Let's talk about Thurman in his high school and college days. In high school, Thurman was an athletic stud. He earned 9 varsity letters. He was captain of the football, basketball, and baseball teams, and he was all-state in all 3 sports. He hit .581 in 1965 in high school, and he was originally a shortstop, but he got moved to catcher because nobody else could handle their high school stud pitcher, Jerome Pruitt. Pruitt would go on to be drafted in the 1965 MLB draft in the 5th round by the Cardinals. He was throwing over 90, Pruitt was, as a junior in high school, and Thurman didn't really have any instruction on how to be a catcher, but he had great instincts. He was such an outstanding athlete that he had college offers for both football and baseball, but he really loved baseball. He had 3 baseball offers. Arizona State offered him a scholarship if he made the team. Ohio University offered him a half scholarship conditional on him making the team. And Kent State offered him a full scholarship with no strings attached. So for a kid with his economic situation, it was a no-brainer. Take the guaranteed scholarship, go to Kent State. He also had the added benefit that he would not be far from his hometown and his girlfriend, Diana. In Thurman's freshman year, Kent State only played in 11 games. 11. The weather just would not allow a full schedule, and Kent State didn't have that kind of money to travel down south to tournaments like some of the bigger schools. In those 11 games, Thurman played in 3, and that was his entire freshman season. The next year, 1967, the weather was better. Kent State finished 11-12. They got in 23 games on the year. Thurman hit .367. He played all 23. He impressed everyone with his arm and his ability to throw out runners. After that sophomore season, he was invited to play in the Cape Cod League. If you're not familiar with the Cape Cod League, it's a very high level of competition. It's aimed at college players who are most likely headed for Major League Baseball. It was and still is a very, very competitive league. Thurman ended up winning the Cape Cod League MVP, hitting .420. After the Cape Cod League was over, back to Kent State for his junior year, Thurman was on fire. He hit .413, and he set the school record for hits, doubles, and triples. He would be the only Kent State player to have his number retired. At the end of the year, he was rated the #1 catcher in the nation, heading into the MLB draft. Thurman ended up being picked 4th in the draft. The Astros picked catcher Martin Cott over Thurman. Cott never panned out. The man in charge of the Astros farm system had this to say, quote, "Picking Cott over Munson, well, we sure paid a price for that. Back then, I looked at a player's physical attributes much more than his mental, and today I know it's about the mental attitude and about his heart. Munson had that. He absolutely overachieved on the abilities his body might have given him because he had that heart of a winner." Thurman had a lot of talent, but he was definitely not gifted with an athlete's body. He was often described as dumpy, and 2 of his nicknames were Tugboat and Squatty Body. Martin Cott was 6'3", 185, and Thurman was maybe 5'11", and at least 190. And when the Yankees drafted Thurman, they went to his house for him to sign the contract. And Lee MacPhail, the Yankees general manager, went. This was, after all, their big #1 pick. MacPhail remembered it like this, quote, "It was the strangest thing. There was his father, and it should have been a joyous day, lying on the couch in the living room. He barely said hello and didn't join us at all for the signing. At one point, he just hollered into us, 'He ain't too good on pop flies, you know.' It was really a bizarre moment. I think he might have even been in his underwear." So, on to Binghamton. Once Thurman signed, he was sent to Binghamton to work out with coach Cloyd Boyer. Boyer's job was to assess Thurman and report back to the Yankees farm director, Johnny Johnson. When Johnson called Boyer to ask where Thurman should start in the system in 1968, Boyer told him, "Yankee Stadium." But despite the glowing reports from Boyer, it was decided to keep Thurman in AA and play for the Binghamton Triplets for 1968. He then moved up to the AAA Syracuse Chiefs for 69, where he was hitting .363 in 28 games before the Army called his number and took him away. Remember, this is 1969 and the Vietnam War was in full swing. Over 2.2 million men would get drafted for Vietnam, and many people would voluntarily enlist to avoid potentially being drafted and sent overseas. Thurman had enlisted in the reserves out of high school, and in 1969, the Army wanted him. He would end up spending 4 months as a clerk at Fort Dix. After his service, Thurman was called up for his MLB debut at the end of the 69 season on August 8th. He would play 26 games and hit .256, but he made a real impression behind the plate. Thurman threw out 54% of runners trying to steal. I mean, that's just crazy. The MLB average is 30% or so. In an interesting coincidence, Thurman would travel down to play in Puerto Rico in the offseason. He would end up being a teammate on the San Juan Crabbers to Roberto Clemente. And if you don't know Roberto Clemente's story, he also would die very tragically in a plane crash. In 1970, Thurman opened the season for the Yankees in a slump. He was 1 for 30 and sitting at an ugly .033 batting average. For a young player who hasn't really established himself in the league, that can be devastating. But manager Ralph Houck, the same manager who, if you saw episode 1, managed Mark Fidrich, told Thurman that he didn't care what he hit. His defense would win them games. In any event, Houck was the right guy for the time for Thurman, and his bat eventually came around. Amazingly, given the hole that he started in, Thurman finished the season with a .302 average, best on the team. After July 21, he hit .370 for the back half of the season. That was good enough for Thurman to win the 1970 Rookie of the Year with 23 of 24 first-place ballots. And Ralph Houck would win Manager of the Year. Thurman was the very first catcher to win the American League Rookie of the Year. Carlton Fisk would win it in 1972. And I only mention that because Thurman and Fisk had a bit of a rivalry, let's say. Fisk, who played for the Boston Red Sox, versus Munson, who played for the New York Yankees. Fisk, the tall, athletic body, 6'3", 200 pounds, versus Munson, the short, dumpy dad bod nicknamed Tugboat and squatty body. Fisk, the guy who from 72 to 76 would go on the DL 4 times and play in 516 games, versus Thurman, the gritty grinder who never went on the DL during that time and caught 720 games in that same time period. So, 1971. I want to mention this card in particular, the 1971 Topps card. In the mid-1960s, a New York kid who got into photography started taking pictures of ball games, and one day he brought some of his photos near the Yankee dugout and showed them to team president Michael Burke. Burke was impressed and offered him a job as the team's first official photographer. And he took this picture of what I think is the best-looking card of the decade. If you know 1971 Topps, this is the first card, or the only card in the set that has a player landscape mode. It's also, if you go back and look at baseball cards from the 50s, 60s, up to, actually, I think this card, they're all static poses. They're fake poses, you know, the fake guy like he's throwing the ball or about to field the ball or holding a bat. This is the first, given that it's number 5 in the set, the first card of an actual true game shot. And I just think it's a work of art. The black borders, the rookie cup. I got this one from fellow YouTuber Sammy Thunder. Thank you, Sammy. But it's awesome. And as great as that 71 card is, unfortunately, the year for Thurman was not so great. He suffered a bit of a sophomore slump and lost over 50 points on his batting average, ending with .251 and setting what would end up being his career high K rate. The team also didn't fare well, finishing 82-80, winning the last game of the year against the Ted Williams coached Senators by forfeit when their fans stormed the field in anger. One positive worth mentioning was Thurman's defense. He set a league and career high by throwing out an incredible 61% of all base runners. That's just crazy. And in 1,019 innings, he had one error. One. And that error was against the Baltimore Orioles. And remember, this is an era where a guy would regularly come home and just try to crush the catcher more than try to tag home. Well, Baltimore's catcher was on second base when Paul Blair doubled. And as the runner barreled around third, Munson set up to make the play at the plate. Thurman caught the ball. There's a massive collision, and he gets knocked out cold. And in the process, dropped the ball. He was completely unconscious for 5 minutes. They took him off the field on a stretcher and took him to the hospital in an ambulance. And the official scorer gave him his only error of the season. I guess by definition, he dropped the ball. It is an error, but tough one. Munson did have a bad concussion, but this was 1971, and this was Thurman Munson, so he was back playing the very next day. I'll skip through the next few years pretty quick. The only thing to mention is that George Steinbrenner bought the Yankees for $10 million, and Steinbrenner, as you may know, has his own way of running things. And after 1 year, manager Ralph Houck, who had just won Manager of the Year, would end up quitting, saying that he couldn't deal with Steinbrenner. And obviously, as we discussed in episode 1, he would end up in Detroit. In spring training of 1974, Thurman was playing an exhibition game in Columbia, South Carolina versus the Mets. And in that game, a batter swung and hit Thurman's throwing hand. An injury that would never really heal that year, probably due to Thurman's reluctance to go on the disabled list. He would play that season through pain, and he also injured the end of his clavicle, tearing cartilage. Maybe from a home plate collision, I don't know. But it affected his throwing, and he started throwing sidearm because of the pain. So because of that, he set career lows for throwing out runners that year at 35%, which is still better than the league average, but nowhere near his 61%. Getting into 1975, Steinbrenner and Munson were in battle at times over things like the length of his hair and his facial hair. But Steinbrenner was smart enough to realize how important Thurman was to the team. He encouraged Billy Martin to name a team captain, and he insinuated that it should be Thurman. This was no small gesture. Lou Gehrig had been the last Yankee team captain. Joe DiMaggio was never a team captain. Mickey Mantle was never a team captain. Yogi Berra, Whitey Ford, they were never team captains. So again, opponents tended to see Thurman as maybe less than friendly, but his teammates absolutely loved him. He sacrificed his body, and he left everything out on the field. His manager loved him too. Billy Martin had an incredible amount of respect and admiration for Thurman, and if you know Billy Martin, that says something. 1976 was a year of rebirth. The Yankees returned to a refurbished Yankee Stadium after having played the previous 2 seasons in Shea. They would go on to win 97 games in the regular season and win the AL East. Thurman hit .319 for the first half of the season, and he was the starting catcher in the All-Star game. It was his 5th All-Star game in 7 seasons. Thurman would end the season hitting .302. He had a respectable 17 home runs and threw out 35% of runners. Not as good as his peak of 61%, but that being said, his value as a team leader and his presence and command on the field, calling games, his ability behind the plate, and leading the Yankees to first place finally earned him the league's most valuable player award. In the postseason, Thurman would hit .435 in the ALCS and an incredible .529 in the World Series as the Yankees got swept by Sparky Anderson and the Big Red Machine. He has the unfortunate distinction of owning the highest batting average of any player on a losing World Series team. Thurman was the first catcher to ever win both Rookie of the Year and MVP in the American League during his career. In 1977, Steinbrenner and the Yankees went all in to try to get over the hump and win a World Series. They signed Reggie Jackson to a 5-year contract, and there was a lot of controversy, well covered in the media, with the relationship between Thurman and Reggie. No doubt Thurman wanted to win, and Reggie brought a .925 OPS to the team in 1977. But Reggie had the reputation as a prima donna and was quoted as saying, quote, "I'm the straw that stirs the drink." So Reggie, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, including manager Billy Martin. But after reading Thurman's biography, I'm convinced that most of the bad blood between Reggie and Thurman maybe was just at the beginning of their relationship, and they found a way to work things out. When Thurman got a plane and he started flying home after road games, he would invite his close teammates along, and mostly this was Lou Piniella, but Reggie was one of the guys who would fly with him. So it seems to me that they had a working relationship. They both had the same goal, which was to win the World Series, which they did. They would beat the Dodgers. In fact, this was the year where Reggie earned his Mr. October nickname, when in Game 6 of the World Series, he hit 3 home runs on 3 pitches. 3 consecutive pitches. After the '77 season, Thurman started taking flying lessons. He was flying a turbocharged twin-prop Beechcraft Duke at the time. Thurman had 91 flight hours, 25 hours solo, and he met the requirements for his pilot's license on June 11, 1978. On June 15, he received the FAA multi-engine rating, and on December 22, he had an instrument rating with just under 300 flight hours. Instrument rating allows a pilot access to larger airports and the ability to fly in bad weather, where visibility dictates flying by instruments. Only 15% of pilots have a current instrument rating, so it's a big deal. In 1978, the Yankees added Goose Gossage to the roster, and Billy Martin was replaced as the manager midseason by Bob Lemon. Billy Martin was fired 5 separate times by Steinbrenner. I'm not kidding. If you don't know the story, it's not a joke. Steinbrenner and Billy Martin had a very rocky relationship. Thurman's body in that year was starting to show the wear and tear of playing so many games behind the plate. Maybe Carlton Fisk's going on the DL when he was injured, it wasn't such a bad idea after all. But Thurman played through pain, and eventually they started rotating him into right field. When he played in right field, he would hit .351 that year. And when he was behind the plate, he would hit .289. So I don't think that's a statistical anomaly. I think that catching really does take that kind of toll on a body. But the Yankees dug a hole, and they were back 14 games in July. Somehow they managed to claw their way back and tie Boston on the final game of the regular season. A 1-game playoff would determine who would face the Royals in the American League Championship Series. Goose Gossage got Carl Yastrzemski to foul out with 2 men on in a 1-run game to seal the victory. And the Yankees would go on to beat Kansas City and then the Dodgers in the World Series for back-to-back World Championships. Thurman hit .320 in the World Series, and he had an .833 OPS. The offseason of 1978 heading into 1979 was a great time for Thurman to connect with his family and fly. In the spring of '79, Thurman upgraded his plane to a more powerful Beechcraft King Air E90. He and Lou Piniella flew a number of times during spring training, including a trip down to the Bahamas, and Piniella was impressed and thought about taking flying lessons himself. He recounted a story of flying with Thurman after a game with Reggie in bad weather, and he said that Thurman was really impressive as a pilot. He was in total control. In December of 1978, Thurman decided it was time to upgrade. He put in an order for his Cessna Citation. This was a big step. The Cessna Citation has jet engines instead of propellers, and he took demo rides in December and April and began his training for the jet in July of 1979. He took 10 flights, had 24 landings, and was licensed for the jet on July 17, 1979. At that time, he had 505 total hours and 688 landings across all types of aircraft. On August 2, 1979, in Canton, Ohio, in the early afternoon, Thurman was enjoying an off day. He took a ride up to the airport and he ran into his buddy Jerry Anderson and Anderson's flight instructor David Hall. He was showing off his new jet and they decided to take it up for a spin. Hall took the co-pilot seat and Anderson the seat behind Thurman. They went up and Thurman demonstrated the power of the jet on a series of touch-and-go landings. I think that when discussing what happened, in order to eliminate any opinion, I'm not going to base this on newspaper articles. I'm going to read directly from the NTSB report of the day. Earlier in the day, Pilot Munson had invited two of his acquaintances, Mr. Hall and Mr. Anderson, to accompany him on a local flight in his recently purchased aircraft. Both passengers were rated pilots, but stated they had not ridden in light jet aircraft prior to this ride. Mr. Hall, whose principal occupation is flight instructor, had instructed Mr. Munson during his flight training for his instrument rating. Mr. Hall was occupying the right front seat. Mr. Anderson was riding the seat just behind the cockpit. About 16:07 Eastern Daylight Time on August 2, 1979, a Cessna Citation piloted by Mr. Thurman Munson crashed short of runway 19 at the Akron-Canton Airport near Canton, Ohio. The pilot was practicing touch-and-go landings during a local flight with two passengers aboard. The aircraft first touched down in a relatively level, clear area about 870 feet short of the runway. The aircraft slid through a small clump of trees, hit a large stump, and came to rest on a road adjacent to the airport boundary fence. Fire erupted immediately after the aircraft came to rest. The two passengers escaped from the wreckage. The pilot was killed. Probable cause and findings. The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this accident to be the pilot's failure to recognize the need for and to take action to maintain sufficient airspeed to prevent a stall into the ground during an attempted landing. The pilot also failed to recognize the need for timely and sufficient power application to prevent the stall during an approach conducted inadvertently without flaps extended. Contributing to the pilot's inability to recognize the problem and to take proper action was his failure to use the appropriate checklist and his non-standard pattern procedures, which resulted in an abnormal approach profile. The funeral and reactions by teammates is covered pretty extensively in Marty Appel's book, Munson. He had a rare inside look with his role in the organization. I'll just summarize by saying that teammates, especially Billy Martin, took the death very hard. For some of these guys, like Greg Nettles, it was the first death of someone close to them. The Yankees really rallied around Thurman's family and supported them. One quote from the funeral from the governor of Ohio that I thought was appropriate. He said, "It is ironic that he died while learning to fly so that he could spend more time with his family." As a sad final note to this, Thurman's death did nothing to change the dynamics of his biological family. There are some terrible quotes from his father following his death. Literally at the funeral, as reported by multiple sources, Thurman's dad approached the coffin. This is at the funeral. Thurman's dad approached the coffin and said, quote, "You always thought you were too big for this world. Well, you weren't. Look who's still standing now, you son of a bitch." Tragic. That's the story of Thurman Munson. I was glad to dive into the story and to learn more about him. I remembered that he was a great player. He had a reputation as being a nearly a Hall of Famer, if not a Hall of Famer. I was only 8 at the time when he died, and I remember people talking about it, but I never really knew the details of what happened. As always, I will include my sources in the show notes, and I encourage you to do your own research. I hope to follow up on this episode with a discussion of Thurman's Hall of Fame potential and his impact on the baseball card hobby. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. Thank you for your time and take care.